we'll have additional protection. I think we need to look at the resources this year because we need the system to work quickly. And a little point or two of clarification sought by Senator Power, I would hope that you will be able to resolve those issues so that the bill can pass and to be fully accepted by all parties in the House.
Senator van Turnhout.
Thank you very much and welcome, Minister. And very much I generally do welcome the bill. I think it's great to see it here before the House. I think it's particularly good that the Minister Seanad used the committee process to bring the heads of the bill. I think we have another example here of that process being used, and I can only encourage more ministers to do that process of bringing bills before committees. I think it's important also that we don't see this bill in isolation. It's part of a suite of legislation with the Children First Bill, the Criminal Justice Withholding of Information on Offences Against Children and Vulnerable Persons Bill, the Criminal Justice Spent Convictions Bill, and of course the recently passed Children's Rights Referendum. So, Minister, I wholeheartedly support it, but obviously I have some concerns that I'd like to raise here today. Firstly, about the length of time it takes to process vetting applications. And I see from the Library and Research Services that the vetting application process has really improved considerably and come down to a matter of weeks. But the reality is, Minister, that it's a matter of weeks for those organisations who are working with particularly vulnerable children who are employing people. But having done a straw poll over the weekend and today, organisations, voluntary youth work organisations, sports organisations, are waiting months. On average, I'm told 3 months, but could be easily up to 6 months for volunteers to be vetted. And I do think we need to hold this into consideration. I know that the bill isn't about resourcing, but actually, when you look at the bill, it puts the same onus on organisations, whether the person is an employer or a volunteer. So for large voluntary organisations, there's some slight get-out clauses, but it's quite a considerable onus and burden being put on them. So some of my concerns are in relation to that. Because obviously I'm very involved, as members of this House would know, in the Girl Guides. And I know myself, you have somebody who volunteers to be a leader. They want to be a leader, they want to be active. Now, I have no difficulty that they don't have unsupervised access with a group. But when you're waiting up to 6 months for that vetting to come through, we can have all the procedures and all the legislation. But then, within the bill, we make it a criminal offence for organisations. So we have to be really careful about the onus. It's very different to being an employee, and being a volunteer who helps out on a weekly basis. And I note the Minister very carefully within the bill, it talks about occasional versus regular. And I think that is important. The difficulty is that sometimes they converge, and that for me is the reality is that and I can speak from the Girl Guides, we would never allow somebody unvetted to be overnight with a group, whether supervised or unsupervised access. They would not be allowed to be in the building. But I have come across situations where the lead up to an event, all the leaders are fine. A leader or two gets sick during the week, cannot go. A parent offers to help out and go along to the weekend. Now, will the organisation, it's just issues that I have that we just need to be concerned about. Now, I can tell you from the Girl Guides, we found other solutions. Other leaders have to come from other areas. But I'm just trying to put a little bit of reality into the bill of how it's going to work in practice. I'm very aware the Department of Justice have employed 20 civilians on a temporary basis, and they have a number of personnel under the Job Bridge scheme to look at the backlog. But what I suppose my concern is that when this bill comes into place, the demand on the Vetting Bureau is going to increase considerably. So will that exacerbate the situation? And we all want to protect children. Nobody in this debate doesn't want to protect children. But sometimes when I'm doing code of ethics training, running training courses, part of me feels that it's like this pendulum. If you think of it, child protection in Ireland as pendulum. For all too long, the pendulum was stuck there. We wanted to ignore, we didn't want to consider that children were being abused in any manner or form. If we saw no evil was taking place. And in a way, then, the pendulum has swung to the other side, and we're so overprotective and putting so much burdens on organisations. And part of me says we have to find that right balance in the centre, where the pendulum swings, keeping an eye to make sure we protect children, but equally not assuming that everybody out there is evil and that it is all about stranger danger. Because the reality is 92% of people who abuse children are known to the family, their family members. It's not stranger danger. So I just sometimes feel that we have to get this balance correct and right. I think it's really important, and I'm happy to see the exchange of soft information. Without soft information being exchanged, we can cite a number of cases over recent years that it will be toothless what we're trying to do. Now, Minister, I do notice in relation to volunteers under Part 3, Section 12, Part 12.3, that it does say about an organisation can have a defence that they didn't know or nor could reasonably expect it to know. So I do feel it partially covers volunteers, but I am a little bit worried that they are of equivalence. The second point I'd like to raise is about portability, and Senator Power raised it about the PPS number. I'm confused about whether we can or can't use it. I know that many people I know will volunteer. If you're a volunteer, you're likely to volunteer in more than one organisation. It's by the nature of your person that you tend to volunteer, and yet you have to go through the same vetting process. Again and again, even if you're volunteering within the space of months or within the space of a year. And I can understand that the Minister says he can't do portability because maybe an offence has taken place in between your two opportunities to volunteer or your employment. But the reality is then, when we talk about the question of revetting, we're told about, it's not practical. But surely, if you're in an organisation for 5+ years, you should be revetted. And for me, within the bill, the Minister can look at it, but there's actually no guidance or guidelines on it. So I am concerned that we're not sending out a clear message to organisations. Because, so once you're in, you're safe, you're okay, you're not a harm to children. And I suppose that's my difficulty between looking at an employer and a volunteer. A volunteer with the Girl Guides will give 2 hours per week. So somebody can be for years volunteering without knowing what happens in all those other hours of their weekly life. Minister, I'm also concerned about the status of being offered a job subject to vetting, and I'm conscious of the High Court case that is currently there before Justice Lavoy about a firefighter or somebody who failed to get a job in Kilkenny County Council because of 5 non-convictions that were said to be alleged criminal damage, road traffic matters and theft, which were all struck out without evidence being heard, but he was refused a job post. So I'm just conscious of the legal status for organisations who say you get this job subject to vetting, but actually what's their status if they're then going to be sued when the information comes through?
1 minute.
Okay, I'll try to be very quick. In relation to child mining, Senator Power raised it, and I'd like to fully support it. I do feel it's the area. If there was one area that I'm looking to put down an amendment, it is in the area of child mining. Because I do think we've excluded far too big a group here. I understand about getting your mother or somebody, family relative, to mind a child. But there are people who are engaging in child mining who are earning a living or are gaining monetary money from it. And I do think they should be covered. If you're any financial gain, you should be covered by this. So we're going to cover all the volunteers. But, if you get a financial gain for minding very small young children, no, we won't cover you in vetting. I have an issue with that, and I want to look to have amendments. And I've looked to see what was in the Dáil, and I do have some concerns. So I'll come back to that given the time constraint. And just on the spent convictions, and I know that bill we currently are looking at, and I am looking to put down amendments, which I said when it was before the House. To be honest, I'm having a dilemma on the spent convictions issue because, for example, shoplifting. If you were shoplifting, and we're saying you can get the spent convictions wiped, but yet we're saying it'll be on your record for life, and therefore, if you apply for any social care work, you cannot get any of those courses because you have a conviction. Now, we know from the statistics that if you haven't reoffended, you're as likely as me or anybody else to commit an offence. So I do have a difficulty that something is carried for somebody throughout life to work with all groups. I can understand about vulnerable children and vulnerable adults, but I do have a concern in the mainstream organisations. Thank you. Apologies for taking some time. Thank you. Welcome, Mr. McGinn.